Starting now. This is Real People. Real issues. Real news. Real people.
I'm Stephanie Allensworth, and this is Real People.
This is Real People.
Hi, welcome to Real People. I'm Stephanie Allensworth. Today I'm here with environmental attorney Gail Pearson, and we are here to talk about the 3M lawsuit that was just settled in February, I believe it was?
It was.
Regarding the PFCs that were being contaminating the city water in all of the west sides, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Give us some background on that and how Lori Swanson went about chasing these guys down.
Yeah, certainly. Well, PFCs, first of all, are perfluorochemicals, and they're a type of chemical that never leaves the environment. So like typical chemicals that are even harmful to us will break down eventually with sunlight or bacteria. PFCs never break down. So the ice age will come and go, and we'll still have PFCs in our waterway. So they learned in 2000 that there were PFC contaminations in all the water in Washington County. So the municipal waters, the individual wells were contaminated with PFCs. Eventually, 3M and the Attorney General started to negotiate how 3M is going to take care of their contamination. When people drink perfluorinated chemicals, they don't eliminate them. So it's a bioaccumulative. So you will have...
like a heavy metal.
Yeah, you will have, well, even worse, because heavy metals eventually leave your body, but perfluorochemicals do not. They stay in you for years. All right, even the laboratory rats that they're doing testing on with these chemicals, they eliminate this chemical in a short period of time. We hold them for years, for decades, sometimes in our organs. It crosses the placenta, it's in our breast milk. But anyway, so the Attorney General said, what are you going to do, 3M? You have damaged our natural resources in Minnesota, and you can put water filter on municipal wells if you want, but we still have the perfluorochemical problem. So Lori Swanson sued 3M because 3M was not willing to do the right thing and pay for the cleanup of these chemicals. So that lawsuit started in 2010.
Yeah, it was $5 billion when it started?
The damages that they estimated were $5 billion to Minnesota, and that would be the highest amount of damages of any environmental lawsuit in history. As it was, the settlement for $850 million was really the largest that will be collected in history.
Wow, wow. But people still are not happy.
They are not happy because even though the natural resources, there is money set aside to start addressing them, how do we clean up our lakes that have contaminated fish that you can't even fish any longer? How do you clean up these areas? So that's what that money is set aside for, to help rebuild our wildlife and try to get rid of these perfluorochemicals. But the community is still left with the diseases that are associated with contamination with these chemicals. And the community really wants 3M to own this, to step up, admit that this is a problem, and take care of the community health issues.
Right, right. Well, you know, we know water is important, right? And this whole lab testing, you know, they said, yes, the PFCs do cause cancer in laboratory animals, but they're harmless to humans. How can that be? That just doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. So certainly that type of response comes from a company like 3M, and 3M continues to say there's no evidence that PFC contamination harms anybody. But that's not what the experts that have studied PFCs have said for a while now. In fact, the body of evidence supports that perfluorochemicals exposure increases your risk of kidney cancer, testicular cancer, weakened immune response in children to vaccines. There are thyroid disease. So all of these things now, the body of science, in fact, recently the ATSDR which is the organization looking at toxic chemicals, has come out with a very different story than these chemicals are safe.
Wow, wow. Well, so they did go out and put filtration systems in, right? And they are sort of owning it, but not all the way. I mean, what more are we asking for, the people of Washington County asking for?
Well, some of the people in Washington County still have their own private wells. So if you go into a home of a person who is on a private well, you would go down in their basement and you would see huge, huge tanks that are trying to filter this PFC chemical out of their water. And so every few months, a company comes in, tests their water again, and changes the filter out and has to replace it. Those individuals would like to get hooked up to the municipal water supply that has the mega filters in them. So that's one step. The other step, really, if you look at other states who are dealing with the PFC contamination, because remember, this is just not a Minnesota problem. We're ground zero. 3M is ground zero for PFC contamination in the world. It is an issue that other states and other countries are dealing with also. So if you look at New York, they have the judges approved a medical monitoring program to address the diseases linked to PFC contamination. In West Virginia and Ohio, as a matter of fact, there was $50 million that DuPont, who bought PFCs from 3M and made Teflon out of that product. DuPont has actually funded a study of $50 million to study the exposure and the disease link between PFC and the community. So 70,000 individuals were studied in it's called now the C8 study. Minnesota can do the same. We can look and study the individuals, not just simply a cancer registry that's not connected to where people live or what the types of diseases. It doesn't look at children. It doesn't look like at grandmothers, granddaughters, and the links between intrauteral exposure of this chemical. The Department of Health does not look at that. Asked at a meeting the other night, the Minnesota Department of Health said, we don't have the mandate from the legislature to study those things. We're not studying thyroid disease. We're not studying cancer in children because we don't have the mandate or the money to do so. So to look at what the Department of Health has done so far and to interpret that as a clean bill of health is really a fallacy.
Right. Oh boy. Well, so now it's been going on for 8 years, and you say the other companies like DuPont and other states have been involved. Has all that happened within the 8 years that this lawsuit was going on?
Well, actually, before Lori Swanson's lawsuit, myself and a team of attorneys were involved in a lawsuit against 3M. So 3M never spent a penny on filtering any water in Washington County until after we filed our lawsuit in 2005. So we filed our lawsuit, and within a year, 3M went to the individual communities and all of a sudden acted like the good neighbor and said, we're going to pay the millions of dollars it costs to put filtering on your water system. So that really began the exposure of 3M PFC contamination to the Washington County community. So that went first, and before that happened, it was a DuPont case. So in West Virginia, DuPont was sued for PFC exposure. The DuPont stepped up to the plate and admitted, yes, we contaminated the water supply in the Ohio Valley area. DuPont also put up $50 million to study the residents, the 70,000 residents, and the diseases that they had to see if there's anything there. And DuPont agreed with the attorneys, part of those attorneys were on my team, to say, if we find an association, we agree that we will not challenge causation anymore. We agree we will own the fact that this chemical causes diseases. So that case actually was the precursor to the work done in Minnesota.
I think that is extremely interesting that, they still said, well, no, we're going to do this, but it's not really that bad, and it isn't harmful to people, even though and there's been studies saying that it doesn't get out of your body. It lingers and lingers and can be passed through the generations. I mean, that's like mercury. Isn't mercury the same way?
It's worse than mercury.
Worse?
And it is like mercury, of course. In fact, Dr. Grandjean, who's one of the experts in the Attorney General's case and also one of the experts that we're working with in our case, gave a TED Talk on that particular event where a mother could actually pass on toxic exposure till their fetus. And he said PFCs is like that, in where we are passing on this chemical. In fact, the only way a woman can get rid of PFCs in their body is by passing it on to their child during pregnancy or during breastfeeding.
Well, that doesn't seem like a good trade-off.
It does not seem like it's not a good trade-off, especially for the children. And the children, Dr. Grandjean have found, are the most vulnerable. In fact, the children's response to childhood vaccinations is reduced when they get higher exposures of PFCs.
Really? Oh, wow. This is very maddening. I get kind of frustrated when I hear these things because we all heard about draining the swamp, right? During the elections, we're going to drain the swamp. But right here in Minnesota, we have a swamp of our own. And Lori Swanson kind of talked about that, too, how our regulatory system doesn't always have our back.
Yeah. I think the comment that you were talking about is Lori Swanson, after the Department of Health published their data on the cancer registry in Minnesota, felt that the timing was interesting just before the lawsuit, and the data itself and the conclusions in the data was disturbing. And when I say interesting, I meant disturbing. And so I think if you really drill down and look at the Department of Health's conclusions, it's very different than experts who really study the actual records and where these individuals live. So if you look at, for instance, the dump off from Jamaica in Washington County, and you survey the individuals right around that dump where the highest concentrations are, almost every single neighbor has cancer or died of cancer. That's an unusual finding that a registry doesn't pick up. The Department of Health knows that. They have been clear that they need a mandate from the legislature to do those types of additional testing. I don't know if they're asking for money. I don't know what they're doing. But however, they have clearly said we don't have the money to do that type of thing.
They don't have the money, huh?
And they don't have the mandate from the legislature. They need both.
I see. Boy, oh boy, that's crazy.
It makes no sense between you and I.
Yeah. And between health and politics, well, we don't want to clean it up, and we know it's a mess, but we're just going to hide it, sweep it under the rug, and let people be human filtration systems.
Yeah.
Hey, but it's not just us. It's the animals. It's the ground. It's the grass. It's the trees. It's the water. It's does it get in the air as well?
It's in the air, and it travels by air. In fact, it was one of the chemicals that they said should be banned from this planet. And so it is.
Well, there's a long list of those.
It's in the albatross. It's all down the Mississippi. 3M was dumping into the Mississippi, so you can track PFC exposure in the Gulf of Mexico. You can track it in eagles in Alaska. So this has traveled all over our planet. So one of the tests that Dr. Grandjean did actually was in a population, a very remote island in the Faroe Islands, and studied this population who are all exposed to PFCs because they eat the fish, that's their main diet. And so that's how they were exposed to this. And you're right, we're the sinkholes for this chemical, and it's staying in our chemical, and it is something that folks need to take action about, because this is not something that should be swept under the rug.
Right. Well, there's, like I said, so many other chemicals that are out there too that are controversial, that we're being told aren't harmful, but yet they're in the dumps, they're in the water, they're in the air, they're everywhere. And it just seems like we're
going backwards.
We're going backwards.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, there is not a law currently that requires a company such as 3M to prove its chemicals are safe before they put them into the environment. So in England, for instance, you can't manufacture a chemical and put it out until you establish that that chemical is safe. So we've got an upside down process here where basically you put it out until harm is proven. And especially when you get a company like 3M that during the years of our trial, so we were in trial in Washington County, we filed a suit and we were litigating for about 4 or 5 years. During that time, 3M was paying individuals to not publish data and studies that show harm connected with PFCs. That was during our trial. So they really commanded the science. They intentionally created relationships with experts, created relationships with clinical trial settings to make sure that no negative information comes out. That's backwards and upside down.
Yeah.
So that information was exposed during the Lori Swanson's trial, and it was really found she filed a punitive damage breach, which means that the 3M acted with reckless disregard to the rights and safety of others. And I want us to think about that. 3M might be a good neighbor in some regards, but with regard to this chemical, they acted with reckless disregard to the rights and safety of others. And that's the worst standard that you can get in a civil lawsuit. And in our case, the judge found, in fact, that they also behaved with the same malice with regard to the residents. So the conversation has to continue. The residents have to understand that time is running out. When they've got kidney cancer, when their children are ill, when Tartan High School, for instance, which has really been, folks from Australia come to Minnesota to do the story on Tartan High School and the high incidence of cancer at that high school. Minnesota needs to do better. We need to step it up, and we need to study this problem here because we started it.
Yeah. Is there any other companies that we know of that use the same chemical? I mean, because I read that they're still using PFCs out there in the world.
Yeah. There is now. So in about 1998 to 2000, 3M decided after they looked at their own information, for several decades, they realized that this is a bioaccumulative, it doesn't degrade in the environment, and it's harmful to laboratory animals and fish in particular. They decided to phase out this chemical. And so it should have happened 20 years beforehand. And at the same time, one of their employees, Cheryl Corrigan, who was the manager overseeing these chemicals, was appointed to the commissioner of the MPCA in Minnesota. And so there was a period of time that we had 3M's employee in charge of this chemical, in charge of our pollution control agency.
Yeah. Regulating itself.
Regulating itself. She was asked to come to testify at the legislature. She never showed up. And short time later, she decided to step down to spend more time with her family.
Oh, imagine that.
Imagine that. That's exactly right. So anyway, but there are, I'm sorry, back to your question. There are other companies now that make this, but the PFCs is a broad class. The real bad chemicals right now that they're talking about are two classes, PFOA and PFOS. So they're longer chain. I know this is getting chemical, but they're longer chains. There are shorter chain PFCs, PFBX, that are being used now as a safer alternative, but I think the jury is still out on that.
Yeah.
So there is self-care. You can do things to avoid PFCs. Don't microwave popcorn, pizza boxes. There are things in the environment that still expose our bodies to PFCs outside of the Washington County drinking water.
Let's go a little more into that. Pizza boxes and popcorn?
So microwave popcorn. So PFCs really make things very slippery. So if you want to prevent food from coating, getting stuck to the paper in your to-go food and things of that nature, you can put PFCs surrounding that to have your carpet stain-free, the Stainmaster line, to have Scotch Guard on your fabrics. That's usually a PFC base. So if you want to practice self-care, those are the types of things that you want to avoid.
Now, I knew about Scotch Guard, but they had done something to Scotch Guard, didn't they? That made it change the formula?
Yeah, they changed the formula, but there are still products that will do the same thing. We just bought a product, a fabric called Krypton, And of course, I looked at it more carefully, and it has short chain PFCs that help it repel stains. So you have to think about this, but primarily you have to understand the risks that's involved, that we do have an increased risk of kidney cancer. Some say prostate cancer, some say non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are some really bad diseases out there that we don't know enough about because there's not enough money being spent to study those in the areas that are the most contaminated, such as Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, there's no money in regulating yourself. So with products that have been being used for years. I mean, when did Teflon even first come out? It's been, what, the 70s?
Yeah, probably. It was a huge market, and DuPont was one of 3M's customers, and they sold this C8 product to several different entities. So it was a great money-making area for them.
But however, I mean, anybody that's used a metal utensil on a Teflon pan knows that you're probably eating a lot of that stuff.
Exactly.
So what about the new pans? Like they've got the orange or the red coated, green,
the copper coated.
The copper coated.
Yeah.
Are those safe?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Because I have one of those.
Yeah,
I'm starting to wonder.
Answer to the question.
I changed to stainless steel and everything.
Yeah.
I wiped out my kitchen and redid the whole thing.
Cast iron. Cast iron is a, and who knows?
It's heavy, though.
It's heavy, and you can't put it in the dishwasher.
Yeah.
So there's always the negative.
You just season the cast iron pan.
That's right. So anyway, but I do think it's important that people really take this seriously.
Oh, yes.
The clock is ticking for these folks because 3M knows this. It knows that now that the lawsuit has been published, so folks understand that there's a contamination problem in Washington County. But that can also start the statute of limitations from ticking, okay? So we have to act fast, and the community has to act fast to understand that you don't get forever. If we wait, for instance, until cigarettes were finally found to cause cancer, most of those lawsuits have passed a statute of limitations that they could bring. Same thing here.
Right.
3M, every time they get interviewed, every time you see a reference to them in the paper, they say there's no evidence that connecting PFCs and disease. So folks get confused. They get lulled into a sense of security. But 3M is using that to fool everybody, because if they don't act, and eventually their statute of limitations will run, and their ability to hold 3M accountable, to have 3M step up to the plate and own this, will be gone.
So that means the settlement is also at jeopardy?
No. So the settlement settles only the claims of natural resources. It does not touch any personal injury claims at all.
It doesn't?
It does not. So the Attorney General settlement and her lawsuit doesn't have the ability to reach into Washington County and address people with kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid disease. It does not touch those cases at all. So, and in fact, people on the witness list for the Attorney General's case were told, you've got to find a personal injury attorney. You've got to find an attorney. Your statute of limitations will run. And that's the danger. And so that people might think that settlement has to do with personal injury. It does not touch it. So individuals in Washington County with those diseases that were exposed need to act, and the community needs to be strong and united.
Yes, it does. Well, that's really, really important information because it is misleading. I was misled by it. There's no fine print there to tell you.
This is a public service announcement, right?
Yeah, there you go, Gail.
We're doing our job here. Yeah, absolutely. So,
well, I have a question that I want to ask you. Right. With the Attorney General running for the governor's position, there might be a seat left open somewhere. Would you consider running?
I think we've got lots of candidates that would be exceptional, and I'm going to vote for one of those candidates, as a matter of fact. So I am rooting for that person. I do my job best by being an advocate for my clients, and the Attorney General does a great job being an advocate for the state, and we both have our roles to play.
Well, right, and it's very similar stuff that you've been doing, what she does and what you do. Every time I see your ads, I think about you because of the opioids. You know, one of the first interview that we did here was with the opioid crisis, and all of this sounds way too familiar. It sounds just like that, with the cover-up and the buyouts, and no, they're not addictive. I mean, you know, I don't mean to take us back there, but I mean, but it is similar.
That's precisely correct. So always, my mother always taught me to be a doubting Thomas. And I think that allows me to think critically of the information that is given to me. I look at the source. I try to understand, you know, what is not being said, not only what is being said, but what's not being said. And I think that exercise helped me a lot looking at the Department of Health study. And it is, but I think the Attorney General's office has got some exceptional attorneys there. Their heart's in the right place. I want them to continue to do their job. I would help them in a heartbeat. But I do think that an individual I will be voting for is going to make an exceptional Attorney General, and I'm going to support that person.
Well, good, because we need more people with their hearts in the right place here in Minnesota and all over this country. Because, like you brought up, even in Europe, they have to meet standards first. And here we're upside down. It's like, oh well, we'll just go until we get caught. Basically.
And I think there's a false sense of security in our country with regard to those issues. And I think that it's wise for folks to think that we need to advocate for ourselves and never stop doing that. And so this is one of the things I would really urge individuals in Washington County. There's a great team of attorneys that I'm working with. We're bringing those cases to court, and I'd love to hear from folks that have questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So your website has been screening across the bottom of the screen, so everybody can reach out to Gal if they have questions, especially those in Washington County that might need some help. So. Yeah, I'm so glad that we had this conversation because I literally had to study. I had to study a little bit for it.
It's such a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
It's a John Grisham novel.
It is, yeah. With that, I've got to say thank you for being here. And he shut me off.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure being here. Thank you. Okay. All right.